Welcome everyone to Building Scalable FME Solutions. Today we're discussing best practices for not only workspaces, but automation and beyond. I have the great pleasure of being joined by Darren from our partner Locus and Mark Ireland joining us from here at SAFE. So I'll pass things over actually to Darren to briefly introduce himself.
Cool. Yeah. Hello, everybody from miserable, wet New Zealand in Wellington, that is. Yes, and my name's Darren Fergus. I'm a certified professional in both form, flow, and certified trainer. Massive advocate for FME. Love it. Lived it and breathed it for over 10 years now. And yeah, that's pretty much all I've got to say there. So I'll pass over to Mark.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mark. It says I'm Knowledge and Community Specialist. You might know me sometimes as the FME Evangelist, which is just sort of the nickname I go by. And I've worked at SAFE for 20 years and a lot of FME experience. And I'm wearing the same glasses and they've got the same lean on in that picture as I'm wearing right now. So
I need to do that as well, Mark. What's it, like kind of like that, is it?
But yeah, it's great to welcome you here today. And well, let's go on to Elizabeth, and you can tell us all about Livestorm platform and what folks need to know.
All right, thanks so much, Mark. Yeah, so I am here as our webinar moderator here today. I run our webinar program and happy to be joining these two on today's webinar. Just briefly, an intro to Livestorm if you are newer to the platform. So if you have any audio or video issues, you can click that help button on the bottom left for 4 simple steps to take. If you'd like to share any reactions with us during the webinar, we love to see those. There may be a joke or two cracked with these two, I'm sure, today. So use that react button to share any reactions throughout. And the questions tab on the bottom right. So we'd encourage you, if you have any questions about today's content, please do drop those into the questions tab. And we'll be keeping an eye on that during the webinar. And then we'll also have a little bit of time at the end for answering some live as well. And then lastly, keep letting us know where you're tuning in from in the chat. We love to see it. Before we dive in here, just a reminder that our early bird pricing for the peak of data integration in Seattle this spring ends pretty soon in just a few weeks' time. So definitely take advantage of that. And we hope to see you all there. Okay, and so before I pass things over to Mark for our agenda here, I'll get our presenters to turn off their webcams just so we can save on some bandwidth for the remainder here.
Good plan.
Awesome, and over to you, Mark.
Well, yeah, so today we're going to look at best practices, which I know we've looked at before. We're going to hopefully try and look at it from a different point of view, and this is one of the reasons we've got Darren in from New Zealand, from Locus. Yeah, well, we're going to do an introduction. We'll look at foundations of project organization, like why is it important that we do best practices? And then Darren's going to take you through building tidy and scalable workspaces. I'm going to go through some things about FME Flow and automation, and then we'll wrap up after that. I think there's going to be a lot of talking today between us, Darren. Do you think that's
oh man, 100%.
Fair comment?
Yeah, Elizabeth's going to be like, right, Mark, Darren, that's enough. We have to move on. We should have made it like 3 hours or a day, mate, I reckon. But hey, we can do future stuff, right? But yeah, 100%.
Yeah, well, we'll try and keep moving, and if we start talking too long, I know Elizabeth will jump on us and make us move faster. So, and speaking of which, Elizabeth, can you start this poll that we have for users? We want to know, how do you kick off a new FME project? Because that's really, I think, what we're looking at today is, how can I put this, more of an enterprise level, not just individual workspaces, though there is that, but where it all fits into a bigger project.
Yeah, so I have launched that over in the polls tab now. So if everyone wants to head over, looks like votes are already rolling in there. It will be really interesting to see.
So how do you do a new project, Darren?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was just about to say, sometimes there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, right? Like it's a more right answer, if that makes sense, right? So usually when I think about starting off a project, I like to try and understand every component of it. All the dependencies, I think, is a big thing. Who are the people that work with? Sometimes you guys, hey, we want to do a project and this is what we want to do. And it's like, right, why do you want to do that though, right? Because sometimes the why is important for you to be able to give the right information and feedback to them around, actually, you're doing this the right way, or you're approaching this in the right way. So asking questions is hugely important, right?
I think that's a very good point, especially when it comes to FME Flow. It's really important to know what the user wants to get out of it, because quite often there might be a better way of doing it, or whatever they want can only be done a certain way. So that tells us how we need to go ahead.
Yeah,
so,
100%.
Yeah.
It's nothing worse when you get into a project and you realize you've missed some really important parts, and it kind of like, well, it just causes a lot more work and pain, right? So, yeah.
Okay, well, I think we should move on to the next part, if we can do that, Elizabeth.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you for contributing your ideas and thoughts in there. Introduction, yeah. So today we're going to look at how to bring scalability and collaboration into the workflows, or ways that will help with scalability and collaboration. Darren, were you going to lead this? Because you're going to talk about FME form, really, and I'm going to talk about FME flow. But we're going to do a little bit at the start where we're just sort of introducing the topic. And
yeah, absolutely. So for those of you that may be here that haven't worked with FME Form, just a safe platform in general, they offer a couple of flexible deployment options. So you've got FME Form, which is the authoring environment where you build your data integration workflows, and automation can be provided then in FME Flow, which is deployed on premise or in a private cloud. Safe also offer FME Flow deployed in a fully hosted AWS cloud environment, and that's called FME Flow Hosted. Really, the integration platform fits in perfectly to any organization, and it's central to everything systems and data and users. And guess what? It does even better when we've got good processes and great governance, and we apply best practice, right? So really, there's nothing to hate, and there's lots of things to love. And best of all, it provides us a fully self-documenting GUI, which we'll be 100% leveraging today. And we're going to be talking about that in quite a lot of detail, Mark, when we get to the demo.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, so just a little bit of an introduction, just to set the scene, start the journey, so to speak. And actually, just before we get into to set a bit of context for everyone else, Mark and I have known each other for a few years now, but this is actually the first time we're doing a webinar together, eh, Mark?
It is, yes. We've done karaoke before together, but not a webinar.
Oh, mate, and you did really, really well, and I kind of brought the sound down on that. Hopefully, I'm not bringing the sound down on this one. So, look, just for everybody else's benefit, this collaboration actually came about from probably, I was going to say our previous conversation, but we've had multiple conversations over the years around best practices. So, and I guess from my perspective, I'm really excited about this presentation with you. As I've always said, you do some amazing work in the FME community with your What's Up Wednesdays and other stuff as well. So for anybody that doesn't know Mark, for an English dude, he's a pretty awesome guy. I'd like to think you think the same of me as well, Mark, right?
Coming from a Scotsman, that's pretty good. Yes, thank you.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thanks
no, we've worked together quite a while, and I'm very interested to see how this looks from a partner point of view. From
for sure.
Practical projects with Locus, and most of the projects I do are fairly, well, they're internal or they're theoretical. I don't get to do as many live projects as I'd like, because that's just not my job.
And look, I think a lot of people might think, oh, best practice, that's boring, but it's actually a lot of fun, because like we're geeks, right? So we love playing with new little tools. We were talking about something the other day, and it was another sort of lead into this, where I work with junctions and you work with tunnels, right? And we're sort of comparing notes about situations where one works better than the other, right? And so just understanding all these things really just allows us to understand the wonderful world of just how easy FME makes it to create what I like to say is a masterpiece of integration, right?
Yeah, I think you're spot on there.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay.
Safe software over the years is a consequence of just being really good at what they do. They now support over 400 different data types in FME. And that goes from geospatial data through to locational intelligence and IT. And something big that we talk about quite a lot, Mark, is AI, right? So really, I suppose Safe Software's goal is to enable you to use your data where, when, and how it's needed, regardless of its source. So this, for me, is where we kind of get to all the juicy stuff, right? That's kind of where the fun begins. We start to talk about some of the key things, I think, when it comes to best practice. One of the biggest questions I think we always have to ask ourselves, and I generally think it encompasses all these key considerations there, is do we really have the big picture? You kind of notice how I said that earlier on, you were the same, right? Like, it really is understanding that big picture. And then we could probably break that down a bit further. So, for example, have we spoken to all those vested in the solution, colleagues, other teams? And that could be internal, external to the organization, or perhaps even those people that supply or consume data. Are we sort of building knowing that we have access to FME Flow or just FME Form? And if we don't have FME Flow, is that something we're going to get in the future? That can be a big game changer on how you approach solving a problem in the first instance, right? And I guess the next couple of things, do we need configurability in our workspaces? Well, a lot of people just build to solve the problem, right? So perhaps you actually don't need that. But the question is, should be? We're thinking about future-proofing solutions. And actually, I think that's a really good one, Mark. And we can talk about that in a little bit more detail coming soon. And then lastly, do we collaborate? So what do we mean by that? If we've got lots of different people working on different workspaces and working in flow environments, we probably need some good measures to manage control about how we access and how we provide governance around naming conventions for workspaces, web or database connections, and the list goes on. And so, like, I think those kind of things set us up pretty well for the next few slides. What do you reckon about that, Mark? What do you think about those statements?
I think that's good. Yeah, I totally, especially the governance and collaboration, because that's another thing I don't get to do a great deal with, is collaborate with other workspace authors, just because we're all doing our own thing, I guess, and not working on one big project or working on several projects that need to be the same. So again, this is very interesting to find out how you look at this compared to me.
Well, I think sometimes, like, we all live in our own little world, right? Like, it's relative to the things we understand. And let's say we're consuming data, we actually might not know the complexity that goes on behind the scenes to how we get that data, right? So we might be making assumptions that aren't taken in or considered within how we solve or build the solution that goes into solving the specific problem for the organization. And so I think these are really, really important things. And I guess the last thing I'll say on that, I suppose, before we move on to the next slide, is the last thing we want is everybody having their own ideas around naming conventions and stuff. So not having those controls and governance, right? Because we've seen it, Mark, you've seen it, helping people, because that's what we do, is sometimes we can help people, sure, but it's much easier when they have certain things in place, right?
Yes, and I suspect you must do that for clients. You must set up
100%, yeah,
a project for them and then pass it over to them, and then it's up to them to maintain. And if you don't set it up properly, then it's going to be twice as difficult for them as it should be.
No, absolutely, yeah.
So the why of best practice? Well, for me, and I put these couple of slides together, is that things aren't static. Requirements change, your skill and your knowledge changes. And you probably know this, but you start a project, you create a whole bunch of workspaces. By the time you get to the 10th workspace, you're saying, well, I've got this technique I'm using and it's really good. And I could probably use that in the previous 9 workspaces as well. So you're changing as the project goes on. You're still learning. There's no way you can learn everything in advance, however much you try. You're still learning while you're doing things.
And one thing I'll say on that, Mark, is actually one of the benefits I have. I've got other, well, you do too, right? But I guess solving a project, I have other expertise in the team. And that's 100%. Look, there's nothing wrong with going to your colleague and saying, hey, look, I've got an idea, and this is how I think I approach it. What's your thoughts on that? And they might go, oh, I've done this in the past, and this is how I did. And you go, wow, that's even better, right? Because what you're doing is you're leveraging that knowledge to improve. You learn from that, and you're more optimal for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, I know we do code reviews at SAFE for the official FME code. Like somebody writes some code and another developer checks it. Well, you can do the same thing with FME. I think that's a great way of working. You do a little bit of a workspace, you show it to a colleague and say, hey, is this the best way of doing something?
Yeah.
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 The other thing is, even once a project goes into development, it's still not static. It's still changing. Requirements change or are added over time. Data might change. So, and that might be an official change, like what we call schema drift. Things might change that way. Or it could be a piece of data that's bad in a certain way that you've never seen before, and it comes through and it messes up the workspace for some reason.
Agreed with those things. Yeah, it can be quite hard work. The bigger the project, the harder the project, right? The more dependencies, and when I say dependencies, I don't necessarily mean dependencies in a workspace or the project itself, but I mean dependencies across the organization, right? The more moving parts, the harder those things are to manage. Because like you said, they're doing stuff, they're changing stuff, and that can be hard to manage for sure.
An FME is an integration platform, so you got to expect that you're integrating different departments. It just adds that level of complexity to things. So, yeah.
Yeah, agreed.
And web services change and staff change as well. People leave, new people come in who might want to do things a different way. So the point is things are never really static. It always moves on. And the thing is, if you don't plan ahead properly, then these changes are going to cause problems. Like they really will. Your project, if you're having problems with a project and it's not working as well as it should do, and you're having to go back and make edits and it's taking you longer than it should do, then the project's not going to grow. You want people to come to you and say, this is fantastic. Can we expand it to include this? And that's not going to happen if you've not planned everything in advance. Things are going to be unreliable. It's going to be difficult to support your end users, because if there is a problem with that one little piece of data that's bad and it's not documented, and so now somebody's got to go in and look through like a dozen workspaces to find out where that data is being used, and it just slows the whole support process down, and everyone gets frustrated, and your return on your investment gets reduced, which is really one of the key things, to be honest.
And this is one of the other reasons why best practice is really important, because all those things you just discussed, if we do best practice and everybody left in the organization, slight exaggeration, guess what? Everything's documented, everything is well structured. So the next person could come in, and of course, it'd be a bit of a challenge, but it would be importantly less of a challenge for them compared to coming in where nothing is documented. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing is, we understand FME is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be like people say, oh, I play this like a video game. And it's like, well, yeah, I can see that. It is. FME is supposed to be fun. And planning's not necessarily fun. And restructuring things when you're in the middle of something is not fun. And then you've done your workspace and you're like, oh, I really can't be bothered to tidy it up or structure it now. And that's not really fun. And it's hard to find motivations to go back to previous work, and it's boring to do documentation. And we don't want you to be bored. We want you to have fun using FME. And really, the thing is to find this balance between best practices and avoiding that completely. So it's not like don't use any best practice. It's not that you want to document every single component that you're doing and write it all down and know everything that's going on. You've got to try and find that happy middle space for you. As an example, the planning isn't that exciting as jumping into a workspace. Well, no. And I did a project. It was for the 12 days of FME contest just before the Christmas break. And it was all about simulating the flight of balloons around the world. And the first thing I did with that project was to sit down and make a workspace to try out that API to find out what it could return to me.
Yeah.
How it worked. The first thing I did wasn't to sit down and plan everything out in detail, because it wouldn't have been fun, and it wouldn't really be that useful at first. You've got to get an understanding of how things are going to work. Yeah.
It's that overall fact finding, right, Mark? It's exactly what we said earlier on. Yeah, 100%. You kind of need to know that information for sure.
And the fact finding can include using FME, playing with some data, see how it works, that sort of thing. And going back to old workspaces, it's like almost like going to the dentist. You think, well, you have a lot of trepidation about going back and looking at something, but it's never as bad as you expect. And even the biggest workspace, if you've got it set up right, you can go back into it
yeah, and actually, I'll just say something on that. Well, a couple of things. Number one, designing a really great-looking workspace can actually be a lot of fun. So that is fun, right? Like, hopefully, I'm going to show everybody now actually how much fun that actually is doing. But if you follow like doing and designing a good workspace, how many people have sat down? Like, actually, you can answer in the chat here, folks. This is a question for everybody. How many people have built a workspace and going, I lived and breathed that. There's no way I'll ever forget how I solved some of these problems. And you come back like, I don't know, 4 weeks, 2 months later or whatever, and you're like, my God, what was I even doing here? Like, I don't even understand how I solved this problem. How could past me be so clever? Or was past me stupid because I've done this workaround that I didn't know was a workaround? For sure, Mark, right? So people, all the folks there, go and put in the chat how many people have done that, right? Because I think we've all done that, eh, Mark?
And you look at a workspace and you wonder how it ever actually worked. That's another...
Yeah, for sure. Well, actually, this next one's going to be a good one to show that, right? So, yeah.
Well, let's move on because we don't want to take too much time. But this is where we're going to do a demo. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and you're going to look at FME Form and give some tips and tricks on that.
I'm gonna. So, yeah, look, Mark, thank you very much for that. So, and look, you can feel free to interject at any point, Mark. I'll be doing quite a lot of talking to this because I love this workspace, and I've modified it a little bit for the purpose. And you might be thinking, why does Darren love this workspace? Because it looks like a spaghetti junction, right? Number one, I want to make something clear here. And I've said I'm a massive advocate for FME, but I'm also a big believer in positive feedback for people, right? So let's just imagine this user has given this to me and gone, hey, Darren, I'd like a bit of Locus help. And I've got a workspace that was working before, or maybe somebody else changed it's not working now, and I can't seem to suss out what's wrong with it, right? Well, I might see this workspace, and clearly we can all see that there's been very little best practice applied to this. However, we have no idea what the training of that person is, right? They might have all been self-learned. They might have been around people that have done the same thing, right? So always be conscious of that. Find a really positive way to encourage them, not to take away their soul, not to take away all their positivity, but give them constructive ways to build better, more scalable, robust solutions, let's call it, right? So now that's all been said and done, and I've got that out there. Yeah, this is a hard workspace to understand. So a couple of key concepts here from FME perspective. If you haven't seen FME Form before, we call this lovely, beautiful white space called the canvas. You got a ribbon for adding things or moving around the workspace. And you got readers, transformers, and usually we'll have writers as well, but in this instance, it's all basically readers. And on the left-hand side, we've got like the navigator that allows us to be able to navigate around big workspaces, but also it's like a file or a folder sort of representation of what we see on here, right? Now, I always like to work in the canvas. So let's go back to the problem we're solving. Now, what's the problem? Well, really, it doesn't work, right? Now, we could go in and just run the workspace, but that's not where we want to start. Really, where we want to start is we want to start detangling everything so we can visualize how we work our way around the workspace, right? So what we're going to do here is this. Let's identify all the readers first, okay? So I'll zoom in and zoom out so everybody can get an idea on what's going on here, right? So this is a reader, and see how that's not connected to anything. And this is what I love about FME, right? So watch this now, right? See these guys, they're all connected to each other. By the way, I love this new 2024 functionality. Oh my God, where's this been all my life, right? See all these little, this is such a cool thing, right? I'm absolutely loving this, mate, right? So here we go. It's a few transformers here, right? And they're all connected. So they all look like they're related because they're all doing something before we go in this feature journal. So we're going to make a few assumptions here. I'm going to select all these, go Control B, boom. There we go. We have a bookmark. But see what I'm saying, right? Straight away, it's like, oh, it looks like there's some kind of relatable components here that are doing something. I can look at this and go, I don't need to know the full context of the workspace. I can go, right, we've got an attribute splitter, attribute manager. So we're doing schema and we're doing values. So what we'll do is we'll go schema and values, right? Just for the timing. This is just to set the scene, folks, okay? I don't have to be 100% accurate here. Right, starting to come together. We probably want to make a bit of space here. So we'll move these a wee bit over and let's do this. And I like to try and be consistent with the way that I go up and down and stuff. It kind of needs to flow. Think about a meandering river, right? Like it needs to flow. Instead of flowing downhill, it's flowing from left to right to make it nice and easy to understand what's happening. Again, I just keep banging on about it, but I'm loving these things here. So look, straight away, looks like we've got some relatable items again. So I think what we'll do is we'll create a bookmark here, and we'll go concatenate values. We'll just call it aggregate because it makes sense to call it what it is there. So aggregate and assign values.
Maybe we could zoom in a little bit so we can see a bit closer.
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
See, now everybody gets to see.
And the reason why you're doing all this is what we talked about before, is that if you don't, then you pass that old workspace on to somebody, it's so difficult for them to know what's happening.
I just think the worst thing about it, Mark, you made me zoom in and now everybody sees how bad my spelling is, especially when I've got something underneath it. Spell it for me. Nah, that's okay, right. So I'll leave this as a food for thought here. Like, see how like this is black and this is gray? We'll come back to that a little bit later, but essentially what that means is that's been disabled, okay? So that might be a problem within our workspace. So straight away, we're starting to identify things that could potentially be issues, right? Okay, so what do we got over here? Got some other stuff. Well, let's create a bit more space again. So that's obviously going to be output to the data. I imagine there'll be a writer there, and we'll chuck this on top like that. And actually, we'll move these a little bit closer, like so. And honestly, guys, you could get so pedantic around this, like it would drive you nuts. But this looks like this all comes together. So we'll put a bookmark around that, and we'll call prep data and where's my and then output. Just for everybody else's benefit, I got a new laptop, so looking from right, I'm just making excuses, right? So I'll zoom out a wee bit again and see this here. Oh, okay, I'll zoom in. See how this is a creator feature reader. So this is actually data going in. Now, this is an interesting one because when we talk about, you start with your data coming in and then you have all your transformations and then you write your data out. Feature readers and feature writers can go anywhere within the workspace. That's why they're a transformer, because they have the capability to be triggered by something or manipulated by a trigger. So it gives us a great amount of flexibility. We can orchestrate a bunch of stuff with data. Not going to go into too much details on that, but for the instance of this workspace making a bit of sense, we're going to drag this over to all our readers so we've got everything in one place, right? So, and then what we're going to do, so just give me a second. We're going to just put a big bookmark around this guy, and we'll call this data. Great. And because these readers are slightly different, we'll call them bookmark, and we'll just call input data conventional, CNV, and we'll leave that just like that, right? And then what we'll do is we'll add in a little thing. In fact, I'll tell you what, before we do that, right, so let's have a quick look at our workspace, right? So I'm going to zoom out, and then I'll zoom in and work through each component. So now can you see how this is just so much easier to understand what's going on? Now, this guy here is kind of like dangling around. So what I'm going to do, this guy's not connected. So you can see this, see how this isn't connected anywhere? So I'm going to put this up here because when I engage with the customer, I'm going to go, is this meant to be connected to something? Are you going to be doing anything with that or not, right? And then we're going to take our public parks because this is all our used input data, right? And Mark, I feel like this is something that you could come in and talk to, because I'll do this. I'm going to add an insert junction here, right? So just for everybody's benefits, insert junction is how I like to do with this. But Mark, tell everybody what you like to do there.
Well, I like to use tunnels. It depends what you're doing, but the whole point is you don't, like in Ghostbusters, you don't cross the streams. And so junctions are a way to, and inserting extra vertices on the line are a way to keep connecting lines from crossing over each other. But if they do have to cross over each other, then there's no way around it. Then you can put a tunnel on there. Yeah. And that will hide it completely. And
so we'll do that for everybody, right? So if we go create tunnel, this is what it does. So obviously, I've left that in place. So if I just delete that there, you can see now you can nice and clearly see that it goes under. Now, the only reason I don't use these is because for a period of time, like it kind of disappears, right? You can see when you click it shows you where it goes. And so I struggle with that because I like to just see where everything is visually the minute I look at the workspace, right? But I can 100% see why people would like using these, because it just takes away a lot of the noise just to look at the functionality, right?
Darren, I was going to say, I think it sort of also means that not everybody wants to work the same way.
100%,
people have got their own ways of doing things, and we can't say, oh, this is the right way of doing it, because it might not work for you. And we just put suggestions out there. The important thing is that whatever you do it consistently throughout your own work, and hopefully as an organization as well.
Yeah, Mark, absolutely right. And here's the thing, how I build a workspace and how my colleagues build a workspace, we all do it slightly different, but we still focus on the main things, right? As long as it's easy to understand, et cetera, right? Now, everybody might notice, and this is a Darren thing, right? I've added a bookmark and just called it Canvas, which might sound a bit weird because obviously the background's called Canvas, but I'll cover off why I've done this in a minute. What we should do with our workspace is have a little bit of information about our workspace, right? Good place to put things like, what does this workspace do? Does this workspace do? Question mark. And then maybe there's dependencies, right? Like what web connections, dependencies. But I can't wait till they get a spell check in this because it saved my life on so many things. Like, so what web connections, database connections there needs to be, and so on. And then maybe the author of the workspace would be good as well. Who's the author and what's the date, what's the version, etc. And of course, for anybody then coming into the workspace, they can go, before I even look at any of this, I'm going to come over here and we're going to understand what it does. So that then context helps you go around building this workspace, okay? So now that we've kind of created something, what we could do, I mean, we could take a gamble and we could go and run it. So let's just go and have a run. You see how we've got prompt for user parameters come up. So we'll just run this now and see what happens. And I love 2024, it's super fast as well, right? And you can see it's failed here, right? So we've got to the point where we can see everything, right? Feature caching, folks, right? When you're debugging, you're developing, always have enable feature caching on and always use prompt parameters. Prompt parameters gives you like a moment in time to check you've got everything correctly applied to the workspace that runs, and feature caching means that you can go and look at all the different changes, what's happening, understand the workspace. And by the way, this is a really good way to learn. Like if you're just starting out in your learning how to build workspaces, go and find something that somebody else has built. Take it offline, obviously talk to them first because you don't want to go and run something that goes and wipes out like the whole department or something. And then just go and test and run these feature caches to these different parts and understand how they're using the functionality. Hey, Mark, I think that's one of the really great learning things you can get with enabling feature caching, right?
I think it is. And that's, I mean, for me, because I run a lot of the community stuff, that's like just a bigger way of doing things. But we see time and again, it's so important for people to share their knowledge, share their ideas, and help each other out and come up with the best way to do things. And
no, totally. Right, so a couple of things to point out, right? We have, this is gray for a reason, it's disabled. Now we can see it's connected, and this is why it's not working, because this is the candidate, this is the base. And also we got one other thing, this is grayed out, so this is not coming in either or being evaluated. So even if we enabled this guy over here, this would work, we'd be missing all these records, and that would be a problem for us. So again, to make sure we do a good job, what we'd actually do, and this is why I love a bookmark around, again, this is a darn thing because I can just go right click, enable all objects in a bookmark. Now you can enable writers, you can enable transformers separately, you can enable readers separately, but having a bookmark around it for me just goes, if I've missed anything, you see how everything's now black, everything's now enabled. So I can just hit the play button. FME is really, really smart. It looks at what's not being cached or run properly, and it will just run that. And you can see we've got this connection name. Now, this is a problem because this is red, right? Now, imagine I've got, and this is where best practice is important, thinking about naming conventions for workspaces. Now, I've got a darn demo database, right? And now this could be like, maybe Mark sent me the workspace and he's called it Mark Demo Database. And I don't have a Mark Demo Database because I've got whatever I've called it. The good thing about a user parameter is when a user parameter is used, you can go and select what works for you, and then that workspace is just dynamically populated. So I can still have a darn connection, Mark can still have a Mark connection, right, with our own credentials, and we can just select that there. However, if we were to make it really efficient, what we'd have is perhaps it would be whatever your organization name is, SQL database. I would call it that and use my connections to connect to it. Mark would call it that and use his connections to connect it. And I send him his workspace and he has to do nothing, right? So whilst this isn't necessarily wrong, at least the user parameters allow for configurability and flexibility, especially when we publish this up to FME Flow, which I'm sure Mark will talk about. But anyway, I'm just going to select this now, and we're going to run the rest of this workspace, and hopefully everything has worked fine. And there we go. And then, of course, I can have a great conversation with the customer, and I'll say, hey, look, I fixed up your workspace as it was, as you provided it, because I identified the problems. Do you mind if we spend half an hour just going through how it might be easier to lay your workspace out and some of the things you can do? And I've done that with quite a few clients, and what they love that we do that, right? And they're like, wow, I've been self-learned, and they usually explain that. So never judge a book by its cover, never belittle anybody, and always find a positive way to help them out, right? And obviously the last question we'd have is what's happening with this, because if it's not being used, we should get rid of it. Don't disable it. Some people will leave things like this in a workspace and disable it. Look, if it's not meant to be there, remove the question of it needing to be there and delete it from the workspace. So hopefully, folks, that was informative and helpful for you to think about why we do this. So if we just have a quick look, right, we've got these lovely bookmarks now laying out. You can see the modularity, you can see the flow, you can see how everything's neat and tidy. And look, I didn't need to understand what the workspace did when I did this. I just used the natural capability of FME, of how the data flows, and I work with that flow to create that outlook. And I suppose if we finish off on one last thing, because we've got bookmarks now, we could go into our bookmarks, and you can see we can click the bookmarks, and that helps us navigate us around the workspace. Okay, cool. Right, so let's get back to the slides, Mark. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, let's do that.
Hey, by the way, just a quick question for everybody. Who preferred the second one? Can everybody see the benefits of doing that? Does anybody else love designing cool workspaces? That was a few questions there, but feel free to engage in the chat, right? Did everybody enjoy that? I think that's important, right? Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Cool.
If we don't talk about them now, we'll talk about them.
Yeah.
The core principles are there. Naming conventions are so important when you're sharing things with different users, with different organizations. The bookmarks and the tunnels and ways to organize your whole workspace have got to be there to structure things. It's way easier to go in and look at a workspace and know what it does when somebody has spent the time to keep it organized. The few points at the bottom are ones that I added onto this slide. Error trapping is important. Try and make sure that anything that you think might come out of a rejected port, that you're going to deal with it. Don't let the end user see the failure, which really applies a lot on FME Flow, because if you have a failure on FME Flow in a web browser, it'll just come up with some gibberish error probably about FME Flow failed for something, and people will look at that and they won't know what that means. They probably don't know what FME is. So if you can catch that error, you can do something with it so the user doesn't see just a failure in the web browser.
Yeah, good points, Mark. Just very quickly, that's the benefit of working with Flow, because Flow makes it easy to notify you if you've got a workspace failure, right? That could be catastrophic failure to designing the workspace inside, that if certain elements of that workspace fails, either instead of sending an email inside the workspaces, creating an automations router to send it via the automation, right, Mark? So yeah, great amount of flexibility coming with FME Flow. Sorry, carry on, Mark.
No, that's okay. I think we'll probably skip on to the next section now, looking at FME Flow. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen for a minute just to comment on a couple of things that we were talking about with Darren's content there. Okay, so let's go back and we'll talk about this. So I wanted to show this example as well. It's an older version of FME, but the point's still valid. I've got a bunch of rejected ports. Obviously, every transformer you put down there's a possibility for a rejected port. And what I do is I connect them all together and connect them to this down here. Basically, what I'm trying to do is error trap things that might happen. I don't think they'll happen because I've tested the workspace, but just in case they happen, I'm connecting it all down to here to this error trap, just to make sure that I do something with the data. And because this is running on FME Flow, it's creating a HTML report. If something goes wrong, all I do is create a HTML report that says, hey, something's gone wrong here. Can you email Mark at Safe about this and include this job number, and then he'll be able to look up and see what went wrong. And it's a lot more professional to do that than just to let it fail and come up with a bad error message in the browser. So that's all I do, is connect all of the rejected ports to here, just to make sure that anything that could happen, I'm handling it in some way. And these are all tunnels as well. And the reason they're tunnels is it lets me move this section about. And that obviously is a bit of an advantage there. I can reorganize things. I can move this section over there, and I don't need to worry about where all these connections are because they're all invisible anyway, so nothing's overlapping. And I know Darren might not agree with that. He might want to show all of the connections and then start editing them to make sure that they don't overlap. But I mean, again, there's no right or wrong way.
I think, and look, we said before, when you did one of your other workspaces, the reason you created it was all the modules essentially were movable, right? You could replace everything, right? And you can't do that with how I do it. So how I would approach this problem is, I shared a workspace previously, is I route all the error trapping. If you think about like a subway or something, so you imagine rings going around the outside at the top and outside at the bottom, and I use these junctions to connect everything up to that, and that's how I manage to do the same thing. And again, like you said, Mark, there's no right or wrong. It's just as long as it's clear, easy to manage, understandable, then that's the key thing.
Yeah. So add a junction instead, but whatever. Yeah. I just wanted to show that as a sort of follow-up to what Darren was talking about. But really, the important thing about FME Flow, and I'm going to look at automations in particular, automations are a series of components, just like your FME workspace. An event happens somewhere. For example, I have an FME Flow server set up to handle everything for the community. So if somebody asks a question or answers a question on the community, and I've got a webhook coming to my FME Flow with that. And that triggers an automation and says, hey, this automation is going to run because an event happened. So we're going to do something in response to that new question. And within that automation is a trigger. So really, that's really what we're aiming at, is the event going straight to the trigger. But I've got it within an automation. So the trigger detects a new question was asked. And it says, okay, well, let's run a workspace. And that workspace will analyze and assess that question that was asked. Why are we doing that? We're not doing it for fun. Well, we have a particular task we want to do, which in this case might be we want to award a user a badge. You ask a question, it's in a particular topic, we award you a badge. And that's how I've got these things set up. We have an event going on, it triggers something, an automation, that runs a workspace, the workspace carries out a task. Easy. So that's how that is set up on FME Flow. The thing is, these components can have multiple relationships to them. So we could have, well, the examples underneath, one trigger might run one workspace, or it could run lots of workspaces, or lots of triggers could run the same workspace, or one workspace could have multiple tasks in it. Or multiple events could run the same trigger, or a single event could run multiple triggers. It's totally one-to-many, many-to-many relationships you can have with this. And what that means is it becomes really, really important to figure out in advance what you're trying to do with FME Flow. Very complex relationships can occur on there. So organizing those components is as important as, maybe more important than organizing your FME workspace components. One of the reasons is because you don't really get annotations and bookmarks in the FME Flow interface the same way as you would get in your workspace. And in your workspace, you've got in the navigator window, you can look and find the workspace parameters and enter a description in there. Well, you can't really do that as much in FME Flow. So it's important that you document things and have it organized a bit more efficiently. Yeah, just to show you very quickly what that would look like. Okay, so we've got FME Flow here, and again, this is the older version just because I'm a version behind for various reasons, but it looks pretty similar. And you can look in the automations, but you can't really say, oh, I want to add information about this. I can click on that automation, but I can't I can edit the tags. I can add some tags to it to say what it does, but I can't add a description in there. I can't say who the author was, that sort of thing. Well, the owner, I can say who it is, but I can't say who edited it last, that sort of information. So some of these things need to be documented a bit more. So how do we structure that? Well, there's various ways we could do that. We could take what I call a condensed approach and say, well, you've got these many-to-many relationships. Well, let's simplify it as much as we can. And we'll say any event that happens, we've only got one automation with as few triggers as possible. Maybe we can get away with one trigger, but since we've got emails and webhooks, we'll have to do 2 triggers. And that will just run one workspace, and that workspace will have to try and figure out what event caused it to run and what should happen with that. So basically one automation, one workspace, any task I need to do is carried out in that workspace. Now for me on the FME Flow side, that would be really simple to set up. I just need to create an automation, a trigger, and run that workspace. But the workspace will be horrendous to set up because it would have to try and figure out which event had caused it to run, and the payload would be different for each. So we'd have to try and pull the different data out of each of them and send it out to do these different tasks. So that would be a great layout for me as the Flow admin, but from the Workspaces author point of view, that would be quite horrendous to have all of your tasks in one workspace. So the other way of doing it will be to say, well, let's do an opposite of that and do it exploded, like everything is its own task. So every task I need to do within my project gets its own workspace. Every workspace gets its own automation. Every automation has its own trigger that is triggered by one event. And maybe an event could even trigger 2 automations at once. And that will be another great way of doing it. It will be exploded. It will be very simple for the workspaces because the workspace only has to carry out one task. But the Flow organization will be overwhelming. You would end up with like hundreds, if not thousands, of different automations in there because you would be trying every single thing you wanted to do in your workspace would have its own individual automation, and that would be quite chaotic. It would be very difficult to manage in Flow. So what we really want to do is take what I call a hybrid approach to that and say, well, let's think about how we can do something that's a bit more organized, a bit more simpler for both of us. And in this example, for example, we've got one automation, but it's got multiple triggers in and it can run multiple workspaces. So I'm not restricting myself to a single workspace, and I can put different tasks in different workspaces there. I mean, that could at some point cause a problem as we're expanding the project because the automation details might get a bit more complicated, but that would be a good way to at least start. One automation, multiple triggers, triggering multiple workspaces. What else might we do? Well, we might organize it, and this is how I've got the FME community server organized, is we've got one event as its own webhook and it will trigger its own automation. So every event type webhook has its own automation with its own trigger, but within that automation it can have multiple workspaces and multiple tasks for that workspace. And in fact, the same workspace could be run by multiple automations. So again, it's more up to you as to how you want to set this up. It's not for me to tell you, oh, you need to do it like this. What I really want to get across is, look, this is important. If you don't get this right from the start, you're going to end up with horrendous workspaces or automations. And I don't think I've really seen anybody talk about this much in terms of best practice. Like, how do you structure automations and things like that? So you need to decide which structure is going to work best for you. Which workspaces go in which automations, which tasks go in which workspaces, which ones are triggered by which events, and so on. It's all up to you to try and figure that out, and preferably before you get too deep into the project. My suggestion for that is start by creating a list of the tasks you want to do. Like in this case, I want to award a badge, say, for asking a certain question, for answering a question in with a certain tag. I want to do a spam check on stuff. I want to check every new user to see if they're a real user or if they're spam. So these are all the tasks I want to do, and I just need to figure out which ones of those could be the same workspace. If I want to award a badge for this event, but a different badge for another event, well, could those badge awards be in the same workspace? And we'll just send the badge number as a parameter and say that would mean I could put those two tasks in one workspace. So it's all about which events need to trigger which tasks. And payload is really important as well, because every different webhook I've got coming into FME Flow has a different payload on it. Like asking a question on the community sends that question to me. Answering a question sends it with different attribute names, different values in there, different information. And I've got to deal with that. And it's best not to try and have one workspace dealing with lots of different payloads within the same workspace. It will be quite chaotic to try and do that. So that's why I've got one event, one webhook, one automation, one workspace, or at least one workspace to do a certain similar tasks.
And can I say something on that, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I'm aware we're going on time, so I'm trying not to interject too much, but I do the exact same thing you just said there, right? When it comes to webhooks, functional tasks, one workspace for each webhook, just like you said, rather than having some kind of conditional logic that has to factor in a bunch of stuff for one big workspace that processes everything slightly different. So I agree 100%. That's the best way to approach that type of problem. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, really important. So that's what I got on the community. Every type of webhook, like question.asked, has its own automation. It can run several workspaces. Workspaces can do similar tasks. Why do we do it like that? Well, for the reasons we've said, but it also helps authors to know where to put existing things, where to put new tools. So if somebody wants to create a new workspace that runs a particular task, they'll know which automation they can put it in depending on which event has occurred that they're trying to connect to. If we've already got an automation, they can just plop a new workspace into that existing automation, connect it to an existing trigger even. Or even they might say, well, look, there's already a workspace that does something fairly similar to what I do. So why don't I download that workspace, add my task into there and publish it back, and that will work just fine. So that's one of the reasons why I set it up like that, because I want everybody to be able to know what the score is, know what the setup is, and know what needs to be done if they want to add something or edit something. But the thing is, you have to document that. If you don't document it, then authors aren't going to be aware of that. So that's something you really have to do. You have to put documentation somewhere so that a new author knows that one automation means one trigger, one webhook. And very quickly going back to here, you can see that I've named all my automations with the platform it's coming from, the name of the webhook, and in some cases, whether it is a webhook or a schedule. So Gainsight question asked webhook, that automation basically says, I'm connected to the community. Every time someone asks a question, it's going to run this automation. Every time someone answers a question, it'll run the question answered webhook. So, and in there we can say, well, look, I'm doing various things like awarding a badge or checking for a badge to do this. This bit, it says badge, but really it's handling the bonus points for an old question. If you answer it, you get extra points. So we're listening for that webhook. We're doing various things with that. We're creating badges for it. But the important thing is that these have got the name of where it's coming from, like SkillJar certification webhook. So you get certified on the SkillJar, which is our academy platform. It sends a message to here and we say, oh yeah, we'll give you a badge on the community for that. And that's important to have that separately to anything else. And that way it's not conflicting with each other. It might even be running the same workspace, a badge. In fact, it probably is awarding a badge in the same way with the same workspace. It's just doing it from a different automation. So that's how that happens. And documentation, I do have documentation. This is our internal documentation where I talk about, well, what I just mentioned was like, well, we could do it everything condensed, or we could do it completely separate. Or in this case, we've got a hybrid approach. Each webhook has its own automation. It's registered to one automation. It runs a single task or multiple tasks of the same type, and so on. And so I've documented this so that anybody else who wants to make changes on our server to do something for the community, they can look at this documentation and say, oh, that's how it works. I'm going to use that server. I'm going to use the existing automation if it's got one. If it doesn't, then I'll create a new one with a new webhook. But at least the user knows, and the authors know now what it is. They know my naming convention, so they know how to set it up. And yeah, that's my documentation for that project, because now it actually works. People will know what they need to do if they want to do changes. And just to sum that up, things to consider: balance the load between form and flow. Don't make your form workspace do all of the sort of handling of different types of automation. Like, don't make your workspace handle all of the different payloads that are coming in. Let your automation sort that out into different workspaces, though the workspace only has to deal with one type of payload. Create your structure that's flexible and helps the project to grow. If somebody looks at your FME Flow and they couldn't tell what was going on, make sure you document it somewhere. And yeah, the last two really, I guess we've mentioned. Don't overload one component with too many tasks, and consider how you can handle all these different payloads efficiently, usually by putting it in a separate workspace. That's how I would do it there. So yeah, that was a very quick run through FME Flow best practices for automation. I mean, this is something we could cover in like hours and hours of stuff.
Agreed. Like I said, we said earlier on, right? We could spend a day talking about this, not 2 days, right? Like there's just
we could absolutely. There's so many aspects and components that could be managed in different ways.
Splitting everything up or whatever, right? Like, and there's always there's not necessarily a right way, but there's always a better way, right? Because that's what we're aiming for. Manageability and efficiency,
Yep. And that's why we invite people to come and talk at our conference, because we want to learn from users as well. We want to know what you're doing so we can try and help make FME the best way, but also so other users can learn from you and do the same sort of improvements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Elizabeth, do you want to help us wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we are nearing the end here. Thanks everyone for hanging back with us a little longer if you were able to. Just some resources to wrap us up today. So we do have lots of upcoming and on-demand webinars to continue your learning journey with FME, depending on what topic you're looking for. We have that handy search function. And then also I'll highlight our FME Academy has got great free instructor-led training options there. In terms of next steps for today, contact us, info@safe.com, if you would like to get any help getting started with your data challenges. And as well, Darren, I'm sure we can, not to put you on the spot, but we could drop your email in the chat as well for folks.
Absolutely, yeah, easy, yeah, for sure.
Fantastic. If you are a member of our FME community, here is a badge code to redeem today as a thank you for joining us. And I'll drop that in the chat. And if you are yet to join our community, we encourage you to check it out. It's a great place to network with other users alike and gain solutions to your challenges.
Enter that code and you'll be running a workspace on my FME Flow installation. So you will be triggering my automations by entering that code.
Very cool. Once again, we hope to see you at our Peak of Data integration this May 6th to 8th. And with that, we do have some time remaining for Q&A. Just a minute here. I know we only actually got one question and like tons of engagement in the chat though. So thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts and ideas throughout. I'll invite Mark to join. Excellent.
Yep, I'm here. Yeah, it was great to see everyone taking part, and there's some fantastic ideas. I like the comments about somebody mentioned taking screenshots of their workspace as they build it, which I thought was a fantastic idea. And somebody else said, "Oh, why don't we video record as you build it?" So I can see that there's this idea of keeping a record of what you've done to figure out. The history window in Workbench does help a lot for that. And of course, there's the workspace compare tool that you can, if you save it as a new version, you can do a compare against the old version to see what's different. So yeah.
Awesome. All right.
But yeah, I mean, there's so much we could talk for hours about this. There's so many different components we could talk about, but we'll try not to do that. But
yeah, we appreciate everyone taking the hour to spend with us, and we hope you got a lot out of today's webinar. And huge thank you to Darren as well for joining us and all his time preparing content, and Mark as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you for keeping us all organized. And to Matthew, I see in the chat whose webinar count is now 25. So I assume that's a new badge at 25. I can't remember, but congratulations. Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. All right. Well, hope you all have a great rest of your day. If you have a moment to fill out our webinar survey, we really appreciate any feedback, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, folks. Bye.
Bye.